In the winter of 1847, the workers at Millbrook Falls Textile Company made a discovery that would haunt the small industrial town of Millbrook Falls, Maine for generations. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the company's main warehouse, they found a collection of birth certificates, marriage licenses, and family documents that revealed a web of relationships so disturbing that the local authorities buried the evidence for over 40 years. The papers documented the systematic intermarriage of the Weatherby family, the town's founding industrial dynasty, spanning 3 generations of deliberate cousin marriages designed to consolidate power and wealth. At the center of this genealogical nightmare stood Silas Weatherby, a man who had married not 1, not 2, but 3 of his first cousins in succession, each union producing children whose fates were carefully hidden from the outside world. What the workers discovered that winter day would expose a family secret so dark that it had required the complicity of doctors, clergy, and local government officials to maintain. Before we continue with the story of Silas Weatherby and the industrial empire built on blood relations, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more dark historical mysteries and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. You might be surprised how many similar family secrets were buried in your own hometown's past. The documents found that day would eventually lead investigators to the Weatherby mansion's 3rd floor, where they would uncover evidence of a practice that had been carefully concealed for decades. Millbrook Falls in the 1850s was a testament to American industrial ambition, a town that had grown from a small farming community of barely 300 souls to a thriving textile center of over 2,000 residents in just 2 decades. The transformation had been swift and absolute, driven entirely by the vision and ruthless business acumen of the Weatherby family. The town sat nestled in a valley where the Millbrook River carved its path through the Maine wilderness, providing the perfect combination of water power and transportation access that made large-scale textile manufacturing not just possible, but profitable. The Weatherby Textile Company dominated the landscape like a feudal castle, its red brick buildings stretching along both sides of the river for nearly half a mile. 4 massive mills churned out cotton cloth, wool fabric, and finished garments that were shipped as far south as Charleston and as far west as Chicago. The constant thunder of the looms created a rhythmic heartbeat that pulsed through the town from dawn until well past sunset, a mechanical symphony that had become as natural to residents as their own breathing. Silas Weatherby stood at the apex of this industrial kingdom, a man whose very presence commanded respect and, increasingly, fear. At 43 years old in 1854, he possessed the kind of lean, angular features that spoke of Puritan ancestry and unwavering determination. His dark hair was already streaked with premature silver, pulled back severely from a face marked by sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of winter ice. Those who worked for him learned quickly to read the subtle signs of his moods, the tightening around his eyes when productivity fell short, the barely perceptible clench of his jaw when questioned about family matters, the way his long fingers would drum against his desk when plotting his next business expansion. The Weatherby mansion rose like a monument to industrial success on the hill overlooking the mills. A 3-story federal-style structure built from local granite and surrounded by carefully manicured grounds that served as a buffer between the family and the working-class neighborhoods below. Its imposing facade, with its symmetrical windows and classical proportions, projected an image of respectability and permanence that few dared to question. Yet there were details about the house that struck observant visitors as odd. Windows on the 3rd floor that were consistently shuttered, despite the floor's obvious habitation indicated by lamplight visible through cracks in the shutters during evening hours. The servants, all of whom lived in quarters attached to the main house, moved through their duties with a curious combination of efficiency and obvious nervousness, particularly when asked about the upper floors or the family's private affairs. The religious life of Millbrook Falls revolved around the imposing presence of the First Congregational Church, a stark white structure whose tall spire dominated the town's skyline. The Weatherby family had been instrumental in its construction and remained its most generous benefactors, a fact that Reverend Josiah Holbrook never allowed his congregation to forget. The good Reverend, a thin man with intense eyes and a voice that could shake the rafters when discussing divine judgment, had arrived in Millbrook Falls the same year Silas took control of the textile company, and the timing had proven providential for both men. Holbrook's sermons frequently touched on themes of family duty, divine providence in business success, and the importance of keeping God's chosen families pure and unified in their purpose. The town's social hierarchy reflected its industrial reality with crystal clarity. At the top sat the Weatherby family, isolated in their mansion like royalty in a castle. Below them clustered the supervisors, skilled craftsmen and small shop owners who depended on the mills for their prosperity. Families like the Hutchinsons, who ran the company store, and the Brewsters, who operated the largest boarding house for mill workers. These families formed a crucial buffer between the Weatherbys and the masses of mill workers who lived in company-built tenements along the river, structures that were functional but hardly comfortable, designed to house the maximum number of workers at the minimum cost. The mill workers themselves came from diverse backgrounds: Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine, French Canadians seeking better wages than the lumber camps offered, and native-born Americans displaced from failing farms throughout northern New England. They worked 12-hour shifts in conditions that were dangerous even by the standards of the 1850s. Surrounded by the constant threat of machinery accidents, cotton dust that clogged lungs and shortened lives, and the ever-present risk of fire that could turn the wooden floors and cotton-filled rooms into deadly infernos within minutes. Yet, despite these hardships, there was something about working for the Weatherby Mills that felt different from other industrial employment. The company provided steady wages, company housing that, while basic, was maintained in good repair, and even a company doctor who treated workers' injuries without charge. Silas Weatherby himself occasionally walked through the mills, observing operations with those penetrating ice-blue eyes, and workers noted that he seemed to remember individual employees' names and circumstances with uncanny accuracy. This attention to detail extended beyond mere business efficiency. Workers whispered among themselves about how Mr. Weatherby seemed particularly interested in their family situations, asking detailed questions about wives, children, and relatives that seemed to go well beyond normal employer concern. The Weatherby family's involvement in every aspect of town life was both comprehensive and subtly controlling. They funded the school, donated books to the library, and provided the land for the town cemetery. When the railroad finally reached Millbrook Falls in 1852, it was Weatherby money that ensured the depot was built in the most convenient location for shipping textile goods. Even the town's newspaper, the Millbrook Chronicle, depended heavily on Weatherby advertising revenue, and its editor, Thomas Caldwell, had developed a remarkable ability to find positive angles on even the most concerning developments in the textile industry. But it was in the realm of family relationships that the Weatherby influence became most complex and troubling. Silas's extended family formed an intricate web throughout the town's power structure. His uncle Ezra managed the company's finances, while his cousin Jeremiah oversaw mill operations. Another uncle, Caleb, served as the town's leading physician, and his cousin Rebecca had married the local magistrate. This network of family connections meant that virtually every important decision in Millbrook Falls was made by someone with Weatherby blood, creating a closed system of power that brooked no outside interference. As 1854 drew to a close, the residents of Millbrook Falls had grown accustomed to the rhythms of their industrial community and the benevolent but absolute authority of the Weatherby family. The mills provided prosperity, the family provided leadership, and the church provided moral guidance that seemed perfectly suited to their circumstances. Few questioned why Silas Weatherby, now in his mid-40s and obviously successful, remained unmarried while his cousins and siblings had long since established families of their own. Those who did wonder about such matters usually concluded that a man of his responsibilities and importance simply hadn't found a woman worthy of his position. They could never have imagined that Silas was already making plans for a marriage that would shock even the most worldly residents of their small industrial town. A union that would be justified by carefully crafted theological arguments and sealed by family loyalties that ran deeper than conventional morality. The announcement came on a crisp October morning in 1854, delivered from the pulpit of the First Congregational Church, with all the solemnity usually reserved for matters of life and death. Reverend Holbrook's voice carried across the packed sanctuary as he proclaimed the banns of marriage between Silas Weatherby and Miss Patience Weatherby, daughter of Ezra Weatherby, Silas's uncle, and the company's financial manager. The congregation sat in stunned silence as the full implications of the announcement settled over them like a shroud. Patience herself sat in the front pew reserved for the Weatherby family, her hands folded primly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the altar with an intensity that suggested either deep religious devotion or barely controlled emotion. At 24, she possessed the kind of pale, delicate beauty that was much admired in that era. Porcelain skin unmarked by the sun, dark hair arranged in elaborate braids, and large grey eyes that seemed to reflect more sadness than joy for a woman on the verge of marriage. Her dress was expensive but conservative. Dark blue wool with jet buttons that caught the morning light streaming through the church's tall windows. The whispers began immediately after the service ended. Hushed conversations between neighbors who had known both bride and groom since childhood. But their first cousins, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson murmured to her husband as they walked home past the mill workers' tenements. Surely that can't be proper, even if it isn't exactly forbidden by law. Her husband, William, who supervised the carding machines and understood better than most how the Weatherby family operated, placed a warning hand on her arm. "That's not our concern, Eleanor. Mr. Weatherby knows his own mind, and Reverend Holbrook wouldn't have announced the bans if there were any impropriety involved." But the conversations continued throughout the town, in the company store, in the boarding houses, and most dangerously among the mill workers during their brief meal breaks. The French Canadians, who had grown up with Catholic teachings about consanguinity, were particularly disturbed by the announcement. In Quebec, such a marriage would require special dispensation from the bishop, muttered Philippe Bouchard, who operated one of the large looms in Mill No. 2. And even then, it would be discouraged. The Irish workers, many of whom had fled poverty so desperate that they had little patience for moral niceties, were more pragmatic in their concerns. "It's the children you have to worry about," observed Bridget O'Malley, one of the few women who worked directly with the machinery rather than in the company boarding houses. "My grandmother always said that when cousins marry, the children suffer God's displeasure. Weak minds, twisted bodies, the sins of the parents visited upon the children." These conversations might have remained nothing more than gossip if not for the intervention of Dr. Marcus Penfield, a physician who had recently arrived in Millbrook Falls from Boston to establish a practice independent of the Weatherby family's influence. Dr. Penfield was a young man, barely 30, but he had studied at Harvard Medical School and brought with him the latest understanding of heredity and family medicine. When he learned of the planned marriage, he felt compelled to speak with Silas privately. The meeting took place in Silas's office on the second floor of the Maine mill building, a spartanly furnished room dominated by a massive oak desk and walls lined with ledger books that documented every aspect of the company's operations. Dr. Penfield had rehearsed his arguments carefully, drawing on both medical knowledge and moral reasoning, but he found himself increasingly unsettled by Silas's calm reaction to his concerns. "Dr. Penfield," Silas said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a man explaining simple concepts to a child, "I appreciate your concern for my family's welfare, but I fear you may be operating under some misconceptions about both the medical and moral aspects of cousin marriage. Have you perhaps discussed this matter with my uncle Caleb? Dr. Caleb Weatherby has been practicing medicine in this region for over 20 years, and I believe you'll find his views on the subject quite different from your own." The younger physician shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Weatherby, I mean no disrespect to your uncle, but the medical literature is quite clear on the risks associated with consanguineous marriages. The likelihood of hereditary defects increases significantly when parents share too much family similarity. Yes, Silas interrupted smoothly. But you're assuming facts about my family that you simply don't possess. The Weatherby lineage is remarkably free from the kind of hereditary weaknesses you're describing. We have maintained careful records for generations, and I can assure you that both patients and I come from exceptionally healthy family lines. Dr. Penfield found himself wondering exactly what kind of records Silas was referring to, but something in the other man's manner discouraged further inquiry. There was a cold certainty in Silas's pale eyes that suggested the conversation was approaching its end, whether the doctor was satisfied or not. Furthermore, Silas continued, I think you'll find that Reverend Holbrook has researched the scriptural and moral dimensions of this marriage quite thoroughly. The Bible contains numerous examples of cousin marriages that were not only acceptable, but specifically blessed by God. Abraham married his half-sister. Isaac married his second cousin Rebekah, and Jacob married sisters who were also his cousins. If such unions were acceptable to the patriarchs, I hardly think we need concern ourselves with the prejudices of modern society. The theological argument was one for which Dr. Penfield had no ready response, but he felt compelled to make one final attempt. Mr. Weatherby, even setting aside medical and religious concerns, surely you must consider the social implications. The workers are already talking, and Silas's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Penfield, I would suggest that you focus your attention on medical matters and leave social concerns to those of us who understand this community's needs. The workers' opinions on my personal affairs are not relevant to anyone's well-being, least of all their own. They would be better served concentrating on their duties rather than speculating about matters that don't concern them. The dismissal was clear, and Dr. Penfield found himself walking back through the town center with more questions than answers. As he passed the company store, he noticed groups of workers huddled in conversation, their voices dropping to whispers when they saw him approaching. The announcement of Silas's engagement had clearly become the dominant topic of conversation throughout Millbrook Falls, and the young doctor sensed that the community was divided between those who accepted Weatherby family decisions without question and those who found the marriage deeply disturbing. That evening, Dr. Penfield made a decision that would later prove to have far-reaching consequences. He began keeping a private journal documenting his observations about the Weatherby family and their influence over Millbrook Falls. His first entry, dated October 15, 1854, included detailed notes about his conversation with Silas and his growing suspicions that the textile magnate's marriage to his cousin was part of a larger pattern of family behavior that had been carefully concealed from outside scrutiny. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a cold November morning when the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the hills around Millbrook Falls. The ceremony was held in the First Congregational Church, with Reverend Holbrook officiating and the entire Weatherby family in attendance. Patience wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of late-season chrysanthemums that had been carefully preserved in the church's cold vestry. What struck many observers as odd was the subdued nature of the celebration. While weddings in Millbrook Falls were typically joyous community events with music, dancing, and festivities that lasted well into the evening, the Weatherby wedding was marked by formal politeness and an almost funereal solemnity. The reception, held in the mansion's main parlor, was attended only by immediate family members and a few selected community leaders. The mill workers, who had been given the afternoon off in honor of their employer's wedding, gathered in small groups throughout the town, but none were invited to participate in the actual celebration. Dr. Penfield, observing from a respectful distance, noted in his journal that night, "The bride appeared pale and withdrawn throughout the ceremony, speaking her vows in a voice so soft that many in the congregation could barely hear her responses. The groom, by contrast, seemed remarkably composed and confident, as though the marriage were a business transaction he had successfully concluded rather than a romantic union. Most disturbing was the reaction of the extended family. While they were present and participated appropriately, there was an undercurrent of tension that suggested this marriage, while not unexpected, was viewed with considerable apprehension by those who know the family best. The newly married couple departed immediately after the reception for a brief honeymoon trip to Portland, leaving behind a community that was still struggling to process what they had witnessed. In the boarding houses and tenements where the mill workers lived, the conversations continued late into the night, fueled by whiskey and growing unease about what the marriage might portend for their small industrial town. "Mark my words," old Timothy Flanagan told the group gathered around the pot-bellied stove in Mrs. Brewster's boarding house. "This is just the beginning. Men like Silas Weatherby don't do anything without a purpose, and that purpose ain't love or loneliness. There's something about that family that ain't natural, and this marriage is going to bring it all into the light." His words proved more prophetic than anyone could have imagined, though it would be years before the full horror of what he had predicted would become apparent to the residents of Millbrook Falls. The first year of Silas and Patience's marriage passed with a normalcy that seemed to vindicate those who had argued that the community's concerns were merely small-town gossip amplified by ignorance and prejudice. The textile business continued to prosper. The mills operated with their usual efficiency, and the young Mrs. Weatherby gradually became a fixture in the town's social life, hosting tea parties for the wives of supervisors and contributing to charity drives organized by the church. Yet there were subtle changes that perceptive observers began to notice as the seasons turned from winter to spring to summer. Patience, who had always been slender, seemed to grow thinner with each passing month, her pale complexion taking on an almost translucent quality that made her appear fragile as spun glass. When she walked through town on her weekly visits to the company store and the church, she moved with a careful, measured gait that suggested either physical discomfort or a conscious effort to maintain perfect self-control. Dr. Penfield, whose practice had grown steadily despite the Weatherby family's preference for their own physician, occasionally encountered Patience during her errands and found himself increasingly concerned about her health. When he ventured to inquire about her well-being during a chance meeting outside the post office, her response was polite but evasive. "I'm quite well, thank you, Dr. Penfield," she said, her grey eyes avoiding direct contact with his. "My Uncle Caleb attends to all of our family's medical needs, as you know. He's been caring for the Weatherbys for decades and understands our particular constitution better than anyone." The way she emphasized the word constitution struck the young doctor as odd. But before he could frame a follow-up question, Patience had excused herself and hurried away toward the mansion on the hill. Dr. Penfield noted in his journal that evening, "Mrs. Weatherby exhibits symptoms that I would normally associate with chronic anxiety or possibly some form of digestive ailment, but her reluctance to discuss her health suggests that such topics are considered inappropriate for anyone outside the immediate family circle." As autumn arrived and the first anniversary of the wedding approached, the community's attention was diverted by more pressing concerns. A fire in Mill No. 3 had resulted in significant damage and the temporary layoff of nearly 200 workers, creating economic hardship that rippled through the entire town. Silas handled the crisis with characteristic efficiency, arranging for the displaced workers to be absorbed into the other mills on reduced schedules while repairs were completed. But the incident served as a stark reminder of how completely Millbrook Falls depended on the Weatherby family's industrial empire. It was during this period of economic uncertainty that Dr. Penfield received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Martha Brewster, who operated the largest boarding house in town, appeared at his office late one evening, her usual confidence replaced by obvious nervousness. "Doctor," she began, settling herself carefully in the chair across from his desk, "I need to ask you about something, but I want your word that it won't go beyond this room." Dr. Penfield assured her of his discretion, and Mrs. Brewster continued with obvious reluctance. "It's about the Weatherby family, and I wouldn't be speaking about them at all if I wasn't genuinely concerned for folks' welfare. You see, I've been running this boarding house for nigh on 15 years now, and in that time, I've housed probably 300 different mill workers. I've seen all kinds come and go, honest folks, troublemakers, drunkards, and saints. But lately, I've been noticing something that doesn't sit right with me." She paused, as though gathering courage to continue. "3 times in the past 6 months, I've had workers, good, reliable men, suddenly pack up and leave town without notice. Now, that's not unusual by itself. Mill work is hard, and men sometimes decide they've had enough and move on. But all 3 of these fellows left right after they'd been asking questions about the Weatherby family." Dr. Penfield leaned forward with interest. "What kind of questions?" "Different things, but all touching on family matters. Old Pete Kowalski, who worked in the dye house, had been wondering aloud why Mr. Silas married his cousin when there were plenty of unmarried ladies in town who would have been honored by his attention. Jimmy Sullivan from the carding room had been making jokes about how the Weatherby family tree didn't have many branches. And most recently, there was Tom Mitchell, who'd been here almost 2 years and was thinking about bringing his wife and children up from Boston." Mrs. Brewster's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Tom had been asking around about schooling for his children, and someone had mentioned that the Weatherby family kept their own children at home rather than sending them to the town school. Tom thought that was curious and started wondering what they might be trying to hide. 2 days after he mentioned this to a few of his friends, Mr. Jeremiah Weatherby called him into the office and told him his position was being eliminated due to improvements in machinery. That seems like it could be a coincidence," Dr. Penfield observed, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it himself. "Maybe," Mrs. Brewster agreed, "but here's what troubles me most. All 3 men left town the very night they were dismissed, and all 3 left behind personal belongings that would have been valuable to working men: tools, warm clothing, books. It's as though they were in such a hurry to leave that they couldn't take the time to pack properly." Dr. Penfield made careful notes as Mrs. Brewster spoke, and after she left, he found himself staring out his office window at the Weatherby mansion on the hill. Lights glowed in the 1st and 2nd floor windows, but the 3rd floor remained dark, its shuttered windows offering no clue to what might lie behind them. The following morning brought news that would transform the community's whispered speculations into something approaching genuine fear. Patience. Weatherby had suffered what Dr. Caleb Weatherby described as a nervous collapse, and had been confined to her bed under strict medical supervision. No details were provided about the nature of her illness, but the fact that she had not been seen in public for several weeks had already prompted considerable speculation among the townspeople. More disturbing was the announcement that came later that same week. Silas Weatherby would be marrying again, this time to his cousin Prudence Weatherby, daughter of his uncle Caleb. The marriage would take place as soon as Patience had recovered sufficiently to give her blessing to the union, which Dr. Caleb Weatherby expected would occur within the month. The announcement struck the community like a physical blow. Even those who had reluctantly accepted Silas's first marriage to a cousin found themselves horrified by the prospect of a second such union, particularly while his first wife lay ill in the mansion on the hill. Reverend Holbrook's explanation, delivered from the pulpit the following Sunday, only deepened the community's unease. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the minister proclaimed, his voice carrying unusual intensity, "and it is not for us to question his divine plan for the Weatherby family. Brother Silas has been called to carry a special burden in this community, providing employment and stability for hundreds of families, and the Lord has seen fit to provide him with helpmates who share his blood and understand his sacred responsibilities. Those who would criticize such arrangements reveal their own lack of faith in God's providence." Dr. Penfield, sitting in his usual pew near the back of the church, noted that Reverend Holbrook's sermon seemed less like a religious message and more like a carefully crafted justification for decisions that had already been made. When the minister spoke about special burdens and sacred responsibilities, his eyes seemed to seek out Silas Weatherby in the front pew, as though the two men were sharing some private understanding that excluded the rest of the congregation. After the service, Dr. Penfield made a decision that would prove to have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. He approached Silas directly as the textile magnate was walking toward his carriage and requested a private meeting to discuss Patience's medical condition. "Mr. Weatherby," the young doctor said, "I understand that your wife is under your uncle's care, but I wonder if a second medical opinion might be beneficial. I've had some experience with nervous disorders and—" Silas turned to face him with an expression that was perfectly polite and absolutely cold. "Dr. Penfield, I appreciate your concern, but my wife's health is a private family matter that will be handled within the family as is appropriate. I'm sure you understand that a woman in Patience's delicate condition requires the care of a physician who has known her since childhood and understands the particular sensitivities of our family line." The phrase, "particular sensitivities," struck Dr. Penfield as oddly ominous, but before he could respond, Silas had climbed into his carriage and driven away, leaving the young doctor standing in the church parking area with a growing sense that Millbrook Falls was hiding secrets far darker than a simple case of cousin marriage. That night, Dr. Penfield made the most detailed entry yet in his private journal. "I am beginning to suspect that the Weatherby family's preference for intermarriage is not merely a matter of keeping wealth concentrated within the family, as I initially assumed. There appears to be something about their bloodline that requires careful management, something that would be obvious to any outside physician but can be concealed by a family doctor who shares their interests. The question that haunts me is whether Patience's illness is the result of her marriage to Silas, or whether she was chosen as his bride precisely because she was expected to develop such symptoms." Within 2 weeks, the community learned that Patience Weatherby had died quietly in her sleep, attended only by Dr. Caleb Weatherby and her immediate family. The funeral was held 3 days later, a small private ceremony that excluded everyone except blood relatives and a few selected community leaders. Silas appeared appropriately grief-stricken, dressed in black from head to toe, but observers noted that his sorrow seemed more theatrical than genuine. Just 36 hours after Patience was buried in the Weatherby family plot in Millbrook Falls Cemetery, Silas married Prudence Weatherby in a ceremony so private that most of the town only learned about it after the fact. This second cousin marriage, conducted with indecent haste after the death of his first wife, finally pushed the community's tolerance beyond its breaking point. The whispered conversations that had begun with the first marriage now became open discussions of increasingly dark possibilities. If Silas could marry one cousin and then immediately marry another after the first wife's convenient death, what other family secrets might be hidden behind the Weatherby family's facade of religious respectability and industrial success? The marriage to Prudence marked the beginning of what the townspeople would later refer to as the dark years in Millbrook Falls. Though at the time, the changes were subtle enough that they crept up on the community like fog rolling in from the coast. Prudence herself seemed an unlikely figure to inspire fear. At 26, she was 3 years older than Patience had been, with auburn hair and green eyes that gave her a more vibrant appearance than her predecessor. Yet there was something in her manner, a nervous energy that manifested itself in rapid speech and restless movements, that suggested she was operating under considerable internal pressure. Dr. Penfield, whose suspicions about the Weatherby family had been growing steadily, began paying closer attention to the patterns of behavior he observed in the mill workers and their families. What he discovered would fill nearly 50 pages of his private journal over the next 2 years, creating a record of systematic intimidation and control that extended far beyond typical employer-employee relationships. The first pattern he noticed involved the questions that were no longer being asked. In the months following Silas's second marriage, conversations about the Weatherby family gradually disappeared from the boarding houses, the company store, and even the church social events. It wasn't that people had stopped being curious. If anything, the rapid succession of cousin marriages had intensified their fascination, but they had learned to keep their speculations private. This change in behavior coincided with a series of apparently unrelated incidents that, when examined together, suggested a coordinated effort to discourage unwelcome attention. Workers who had previously been outspoken about family matters found themselves assigned to the most dangerous positions in the mills, operating machinery that required constant vigilance to avoid serious injury. Others discovered that their requests for time off to visit relatives or attend family events were consistently denied, while workers who avoided controversial topics found their schedules surprisingly flexible. The most effective form of pressure, however, involved the company housing that sheltered nearly 2/3 of the mill workers and their families. Families who were perceived as cooperative found their rent reduced, their quarters improved with new furniture or fresh paint, and their children given priority for the limited slots in the company school. Those who were seen as potential troublemakers discovered that their housing was subject to sudden inspections that revealed violations of company policies they had never been told existed. Mrs. Brewster, who had first brought her concerns to Dr. Penfield, found herself in an increasingly precarious position as her boarding house license came up for renewal. Town clerk Samuel Weatherby, yet another cousin, informed her that new regulations required boarding house operators to provide detailed reports on their tenants' behavior, including any discussions of a political or personal nature that might disturb community harmony. Mrs. Brewster, he explained with bureaucratic precision, the town council has determined that boarding houses serve a crucial role in maintaining order among our working population. We need to ensure that these establishments promote the values of hard work, personal responsibility, and respect for established authority that make our community prosperous. The message was clear. Continue to report on conversations about the Weatherby family, or lose the business that provided her livelihood. Mrs. Brewster agreed to the new requirements, but that evening she appeared once again at Dr. Penfield's office. "Doctor," she said, her voice heavy with resignation, "I want you to know that I won't be able to share information with you anymore. I have a granddaughter to support, and I can't risk losing my license. But I also can't in good conscience stop worrying about what's happening in this town." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small leather notebook. "I've been keeping my own records of the strange things I've observed over the past few years. I want you to have this, because I think someone who isn't dependent on the Weatherbys for their living should know what's been happening." Dr. Penfield accepted the notebook and spent that entire night reading through Mrs. Brewster's carefully documented observations. What he found was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond normal business practices and suggested a level of social control that bordered on the totalitarian. Mrs. Brewster had recorded dozens of incidents in which mill workers or their family members had experienced misfortune shortly after expressing curiosity about the Weatherby family's private affairs. A woman who had wondered aloud why Prudence looked so nervous at church social events found her husband assigned to work with particularly dangerous machinery. He lost 2 fingers in an accident the following week. A man who had joked about keeping track of Weatherby marriages found his teenage son dismissed from his job at the company store for allegedly stealing merchandise that was later discovered to have been miscounted. Most disturbing were the entries that dealt with the Weatherby children, or rather the absence of visible children despite multiple marriages within the family. Mrs. Brewster had made note of the fact that while both Patience and Prudence had exhibited physical signs suggesting pregnancy during their marriages to Silas, no birth announcements had ever been made, and no children had been observed in the company of their parents during public appearances. "Where are the children?" Mrs. Brewster had written in her final entry. "In 2 years of marriage to Patience and now 8 months with Prudence, surely there should be evidence of children if these marriages are producing the family expansion that would justify the unusual arrangements. The 3rd floor of the mansion remains shuttered. Lights are seen there at odd hours, and servants who work in that house have signed agreements that prevent them from discussing their duties with anyone outside the family. What are they hiding up there?" Dr. Penfield closed the notebook and walked to his window, staring up at the Weatherby mansion, where lights glowed in the first and second floor windows, while the third floor remained dark and mysterious. As he watched, he saw a flicker of movement behind one of the shuttered windows, just a brief shadow passing in front of a hidden light source. But it was enough to confirm that the third floor was indeed inhabited. The next morning brought news that would accelerate the young doctor's investigation in ways he could never have anticipated. Prudence Weatherby had been found unconscious in the mansion's garden, apparently having collapsed while tending to her rose bushes. She had been carried inside by the gardener and placed under the care of Dr. Caleb Weatherby, who announced that she was suffering from the same type of nervous exhaustion that had afflicted her predecessor. Within hours, the announcement came that Silas Weatherby was seeking permission from the town council to marry his third cousin, Charity Weatherby, daughter of his late father's brother Nathaniel. The speed of this announcement, made while Prudence lay unconscious in the mansion, shocked even those community members who had grown accustomed to the family's unusual marriage practices. Dr. Penfield realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience. A systematic pattern of cousin marriages that seemed designed not for love or even economic convenience, but for some darker purpose that required the careful control of bloodlines and the systematic silencing of anyone who might investigate too closely. That evening, as he updated his journal with the day's developments, Dr. Penfield made a decision that would ultimately expose the truth about the Weatherby family, though at a cost far greater than he could have imagined. He would begin conducting his own investigation into the third floor of the Weatherby mansion, using whatever means necessary to discover what was being hidden behind those shuttered windows. The investigation began with careful observation of the mansion's daily routines, a surveillance that Dr. Penfield conducted during his regular walks through the residential areas where he visited patients. What he discovered was a household that operated with military precision, but only during daylight hours. After sunset, the patterns changed dramatically. During the day, servants moved through their duties with the efficiency of a well-trained staff, tending to the grounds, managing deliveries, and maintaining the mansion's imposing facade. But as darkness fell, Dr. Penfield noticed that certain servants, always the same 3 women, would enter the house through a side door and climb the servants' staircase that led directly to the third floor. They carried with them items that struck the observant physician as medically significant: basins of water, clean linens, and bottles that appeared to contain medicines or tonics. More revealing were the sounds that occasionally drifted from the shuttered windows during the quiet hours after midnight. Dr. Penfield, conducting his surveillance from the shadow of the carriage house that served the town's wealthiest families, heard what could only be described as crying. Not the brief weeping of adult sorrow, but the sustained, exhausted crying of children in distress. The breakthrough in his investigation came from an unexpected source: Mary Catherine O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had been hired as a temporary servant during Prudence's illness. Mary Catherine was young, barely 18, and possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that made her naturally curious about her surroundings. More importantly, she had not yet learned the importance of maintaining silence about Weatherby family affairs. She approached Dr. Penfield after Sunday services, waiting until the crowd had dispersed before speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "Doctor, I need to speak with someone about what I've seen in that house, and you're the only person in this town who isn't related to the Weatherbys or dependent on them for everything." Dr. Penfield arranged to meet with Mary Catherine that evening in his office, where she provided testimony that confirmed his worst suspicions and revealed horrors that went beyond anything he had imagined. "The third floor," Mary Catherine began, her hands trembling as she spoke. "It's not empty like everyone thinks. There are 6 rooms up there, all of them occupied, and what's in those rooms? Doctor, I've seen things that will haunt me for the rest of my life." She described a corridor lined with doors, each equipped with heavy locks that were operated from the outside. Behind those doors were children, ranging in age from infants to young teenagers, who exhibited physical and mental abnormalities that marked them unmistakably as the products of consanguineous unions. There's a boy, maybe 12 years old, who can't speak properly and has to be fed by hand because his coordination is so poor. Mary Catherine continued, her voice breaking with emotion. There's a girl about 8 who rocks back and forth constantly and makes sounds like an animal when she's frightened. The babies. Doctor, some of those babies don't look right at all. Their heads are too big, or their limbs are twisted, or their eyes don't focus the way they should. Dr. Penfield felt his blood turn cold as Mary Catherine's testimony confirmed what his medical training had suggested. The Weatherby family's practice of intermarriage was producing exactly the kind of genetic consequences that modern medicine had begun to understand, and the family was systematically hiding the evidence by imprisoning their own defective offspring. Who cares for these children? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The same 3 women who work up there every night, Mrs. Abernathy, Mrs. Caldwell, and Mrs. Hutchinson. They've all signed papers that prevent them from talking about their work. But I heard Mrs. Abernathy tell one of the others that they've been caring for Weatherby children for over 20 years. Doctor, that means this has been going on since long before Mr. Silas started marrying his cousins. The implications hit Dr. Penfield like a physical blow. The current generation's practice of cousin marriage was not an aberration, but the continuation of a family tradition that had been producing hidden victims for decades. Silas's father and grandfather had likely engaged in similar practices, creating a bloodline so compromised that normal marriage outside the family would risk exposing the genetic damage through children who might not survive or who would display obvious signs of hereditary defects. Mary Catherine, Dr. Penfield said carefully, have you seen any records or documents that might indicate how many children are being kept up there, or how long individual children have been confined? The young woman nodded grimly. Mrs. Abernathy keeps a logbook that records feeding times, medications, and what she calls incidents, times when the children become violent or need to be restrained. I managed to look at it briefly, and doctor, there are entries going back 15 years. Some children are listed as deceased with dates, but others just have entries that stop suddenly without explanation. Dr. Penfield realized that he was looking at evidence of not just genetic manipulation and child imprisonment, but quite possibly murder. Children whose disabilities made them too difficult to manage or whose conditions deteriorated beyond the family's ability to hide them were simply eliminated, their deaths recorded in a servant's logbook with the same clinical detachment used for recording meals or laundry. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millbrook Falls intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. There's more, Mary Catherine continued, and Dr. Penfield braced himself for additional revelations. Mr. Silas visits the 3rd floor every evening at exactly 9 o'clock. He walks through each room, examining the children like a farmer checking livestock. He makes notes in a separate book, a leather-bound journal that he keeps locked in a safe in his study. And doctor, when he looks at those children, there's no emotion in his face at all. No love, no sorrow, no guilt. It's like he's conducting some kind of scientific experiment. The young woman's description painted a picture of systematic cruelty that went beyond neglect or even abuse. Silas Weatherby was treating his own offspring as experimental subjects, documenting the effects of inbreeding with the dispassionate interest of a researcher studying laboratory animals. What about his wives? Dr. Penfield asked. Did Patience or Prudence know about the children? Mary Catherine's expression grew even more troubled. That's the worst part, doctor. Both of them knew. Patience used to cry for hours after visiting the 3rd floor, and Prudence became more agitated every day as her own pregnancy progressed. The night she collapsed in the garden, I heard her screaming at Mr. Silas that she wouldn't let her baby end up like the others. She was trying to run away, Doctor, but she collapsed before she could reach the gate. Dr. Penfield understood now why both of Silas's wives had died or fallen seriously ill. They had been selected not just for their bloodline compatibility, but for their psychological vulnerability. Women who could be controlled through fear and manipulation, who would bear children for the family's genetic experiments, and then be eliminated when they became inconvenient or threatened to expose the truth. The young doctor faced a moral crisis that would define the rest of his life. He possessed evidence of crimes that included child imprisonment, systematic abuse, and quite possibly murder. But he was one man facing a family that controlled virtually every aspect of life in Millbrook Falls. The Weatherbys owned the mills that provided employment for most of the town, controlled the local government through family connections, and had the backing of the church through Reverend Holbrook's theological justifications. Moreover, any attempt to expose the truth would require convincing outside authorities to investigate a prominent family based on the testimony of a young Irish servant girl and a recently arrived doctor who had no standing in the community. The legal system in 1850s Maine was not designed to protect the powerless from the powerful, especially when the powerful had carefully constructed a facade of religious respectability and community leadership. But Dr. Penfield also understood that silence would make him complicit in ongoing atrocities. Every day that passed meant another day of suffering for the imprisoned children, and every month brought the possibility that Silas would eliminate witnesses or destroy evidence that could lead to justice. As he walked Mary Catherine to the door of his office, Dr. Penfield made a decision that would ultimately cost him everything, but would also ensure that the truth about the Weatherby family would eventually come to light. "Mary Catherine," he said, "I want you to continue working at the mansion, but I want you to be very careful about what you say and do. Don't let anyone suspect that you've spoken to me, and don't take any risks to gather additional information. I'm going to find a way to expose what's happening up there, but it's going to take time and planning." The young woman nodded, but her next words chilled him to the bone. "Doctor, I don't think we have much time. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned that Mr. Silas is planning to make changes after his marriage to Miss Charity. She said something about cleaning house and making sure there are no loose ends that could cause problems for the new generation." Dr. Penfield realized that Silas's planned third marriage was not just another step in his pattern of cousin marriages, but potentially the culmination of decades of genetic experimentation. The textile magnate was preparing to eliminate the evidence of his family's crimes, which meant that the imprisoned children were in immediate danger of being murdered to protect the family's secrets. As Mary Catherine disappeared into the darkness, Dr. Penfield returned to his office and began writing what he knew might be his final journal entry. If his investigation was discovered before he could expose the truth, he wanted to leave behind a record that would eventually lead to justice, even if he himself did not survive to see it. The plan Dr. Penfield devised was desperate, dangerous, and entirely dependent on timing that would require both courage and extraordinary luck. He would need to gain access to the Weatherby mansion's third floor during the confusion surrounding Silas's wedding to Charity, document the conditions he found there with written testimony and physical evidence, and then get that evidence into the hands of state authorities before the family could silence him permanently. The wedding was scheduled for December 15th, 1856, exactly 2 years and 1 month after Silas's marriage to Patience. Prudence had died 3 weeks earlier, her death attributed by Dr. Caleb Weatherby to complications arising from nervous exhaustion and constitutional weakness, medical language that concealed what Mary Catherine had privately described as the physical and mental breakdown of a woman who could no longer endure the horror of her situation. Charity Weatherby, the intended third bride, presented a different challenge for the family's marriage strategy. At 31, she was older than her predecessors and had never married, which led to whispered speculation that she might be more difficult to control than her younger cousins had been. She was also known to possess a sharp intelligence and strong will that had made her valuable as an administrator in the family's business operations, but might make her resistant to the psychological manipulation that had characterized Silas's previous marriages. Dr. Penfield's access to the mansion would come through a medical emergency that he intended to create through careful timing and Mary Catherine's assistance. On the evening of December 14th, during the pre-wedding reception for family members and select community leaders, Mary Catherine would administer a mild emetic to several of the guests, creating symptoms that would require immediate medical attention and justify Dr. Penfield's presence in the house. While treating the food poisoning victims, Dr. Penfield would slip away to the third floor, document what he found there with a small camera he had purchased in Portland, one of the new devices that used glass plates to create permanent images, and gather physical evidence that could be used to support criminal charges. Mary Catherine would serve as his lookout, using a system of signals to warn him if anyone approached the third floor. The plan began to unfold exactly as anticipated. Mary Catherine, working as a server during the reception, managed to introduce the emetic into the punch bowl that served the family members and close associates. Within an hour, 8 people were experiencing severe nausea and vomiting, including Reverend Holbrook and Town Clerk Samuel Weatherby. Dr. Caleb Weatherby, who was 73 years old and had been drinking heavily during the evening, was in no condition to handle multiple medical emergencies simultaneously. Silas, faced with the prospect of having his wedding disrupted by a medical crisis that might reflect poorly on the family's reputation, reluctantly agreed to allow Dr. Penfield to assist with treating the affected guests. As Dr. Penfield worked to stabilize his patients with treatments that were more theatrical than necessary, Mary Catherine appeared at his side with the news that one of the third-floor children was experiencing what appeared to be a seizure and might require immediate medical attention. "Doctor," she said loudly enough for Silas to hear, "Mrs. Abernathy says there's a child upstairs who's having some kind of fit. She's asking if you could take a look since Dr. Caleb is indisposed." Silas's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went completely white, and his eyes darted toward the staircase, as though he were calculating whether he could reach the third floor before Dr. Penfield could see what was there. But with 8 prominent community members witnessing the exchange, he had no choice but to allow the visiting physician to attend to what was ostensibly a medical emergency. "Of course," Silas said, his voice strained with barely controlled panic. "Dr. Penfield, please do whatever is necessary. Mrs. O'Brien will show you the way." Late. The climb to the third floor felt like an ascent into hell itself. As Dr. Penfield followed Mary Catherine up the narrow servant staircase, the sounds that had occasionally drifted from the shuttered windows became a cacophony of human suffering that grew louder with each step. Children were crying, some in the wordless wails of severe mental disability, others in the more articulate sobs of those who understood their situation but were powerless to change it. The corridor that greeted Dr. Penfield at the top of the stairs was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 6 doors lined the hallway, each equipped with heavy locks and small windows that allowed observation of the occupants. The air was thick with the smell of human waste, medicinal compounds, and the unmistakable odor of bodies that had not been properly cleaned in far too long. Mrs. Abernathy, a woman in her 60s who had clearly been hardened by years of managing this human nightmare, greeted Dr. Penfield with professional detachment. "It's the boy in room 4, Doctor. He's been having these episodes more frequently, and tonight's is particularly severe." Dr. Penfield followed her to the indicated room and peered through the observation window. What he saw was a child of perhaps 14, though his developmental disabilities made accurate age assessment difficult. The boy was experiencing what appeared to be a grand mal seizure, his body convulsing violently as he lay on a mattress that was stained with evidence of similar previous episodes. But it was the other children that provided the most damning evidence of the Weatherby family's crimes. In the room directly across the corridor, a girl who appeared to be about 10 years old sat rocking back and forth, while hitting her head repeatedly against the wall. Her skull showed the scars of previous self-inflicted injuries, and her eyes held the vacant stare of severe intellectual disability. Room 3 contained what could only be described as a human tragedy in miniature. Twin infants, perhaps 18 months old, who exhibited the characteristic features of severe genetic disorders. Their heads were enlarged and misshapen, their limbs were twisted and underdeveloped, and their eyes moved independently of each other in a way that suggested serious neurological damage. The systematic documentation that Dr. Penfield had planned became secondary to the immediate moral imperative of bearing witness to suffering that defied human comprehension. As he moved from room to room, using his medical training to assess the conditions he observed, he realized that he was looking at the accumulated evidence of decades of genetic experimentation conducted with complete disregard for the humanity of the victims. While treating the seizing child with techniques designed to prevent him from injuring himself further, Dr. Penfield managed to photograph several of the rooms using his concealed camera. The images, though crude by later standards, would provide undeniable evidence of the conditions in which the Weatherby children were being kept. More damning still was the discovery of Dr. Caleb Weatherby's medical records, kept in a locked cabinet that Mary Catherine had learned to open during her weeks of working in the house. The records documented not just the birth defects and developmental disabilities of the imprisoned children, but also the systematic breeding program that had produced them. The leather-bound journal that Mary Catherine had mentioned contained entries spanning more than 20 years, written in Dr. Caleb's careful handwriting. The early entries documented marriages between Silas's father and his first cousin, producing children with what the doctor clinically described as moderate constitutional weaknesses. Later entries detailed the marriages of uncles and cousins within the extended family, each union carefully calculated to concentrate certain bloodline characteristics while attempting to minimize others. Most horrifying were the experimental notes that treated human reproduction as though it were livestock breeding. Dr. Caleb had documented attempts to produce children with specific physical characteristics, had recorded which genetic combinations produced the most severe disabilities, and had made recommendations for future marriages based entirely on the likelihood of producing manageable offspring. The journal's most recent entries revealed the true purpose behind Silas's successive marriages to his cousins. Each wife had been selected not just for her bloodline compatibility, but for specific genetic traits that might, when combined with Silas's own genetic heritage, produce children whose disabilities were severe enough to justify permanent confinement, but not so severe as to require immediate elimination. As Dr. Penfield photographed the most damaging pages of the journal, Mary Catherine appeared at the door of the medical records room with news that would transform his investigation from a documentation mission into a desperate fight for survival. "Doctor," she whispered urgently, "Mr. Silas is coming upstairs. Mrs. Abernathy tried to tell him that you were still treating the seizing child, but he said he needed to check on something personally. You have maybe 2 minutes before he reaches this floor." Dr. Penfield realized that his discovery of the medical records had taken longer than anticipated, and that Silas's appearance on the 3rd floor almost certainly meant that the textile magnate suspected his family's secrets were being exposed. If Silas found him in the records room with the photographed evidence, both Dr. Penfield and Mary Catherine would likely join the children as permanent prisoners, or worse. The young doctor made a decision that required him to abandon both his medical ethics and his personal safety. Rather than attempting to hide the evidence of his investigation, he chose to confront Silas directly with what he had discovered, gambling that the presence of witnesses downstairs and the photographic evidence he had already secured would provide enough protection to allow him to escape the mansion alive. When Silas appeared in the 3rd floor corridor, his face was a mask of barely controlled fury. He had clearly realized that Dr. Penfield's presence on the 3rd floor had nothing to do with treating a medical emergency and everything to do with exposing the family's carefully guarded secrets. "Dr. Penfield," Silas said, his voice carrying the cold precision of a man accustomed to absolute control. "I think you may have misunderstood the nature of the medical situation that brought you up here. These children are under specialized care for hereditary conditions that require family physicians who understand their particular needs." Dr. Penfield, standing in the corridor with his camera and the photographed journal pages hidden in his medical bag, faced the man whose family had terrorized Millbrook Falls for decades. The confrontation would determine not just his own survival, but the fate of the imprisoned children and the future of everyone in the community who had lived under Weatherby control. "Mr. Weatherby," Dr. Penfield replied, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "I think we both know that what I've seen here tonight has nothing to do with medical treatment and everything to do with the systematic abuse and imprisonment of children whose only crime was being born into a family that values genetic purity over human dignity." The battle lines were drawn, and only one of them would leave the Weatherby mansion alive. The confrontation in the third-floor corridor lasted only minutes, but those minutes would determine the fate of Millbrook Falls for generations to come. Silas Weatherby, faced with the complete exposure of his family's decades-long crimes, made a calculation that revealed the true depths of his moral corruption. "Dr. Penfield," he said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man discussing business arrangements, "I think you may be misunderstanding the situation here. These children receive the best care possible given their unfortunate conditions. They are fed, clothed, and provided with medical attention that far exceeds what they would receive in any state institution." Dr. Penfield realized that Silas was attempting to negotiate, offering justifications for the unjustifiable in hopes of securing his silence. The textile magnate was revealing that he genuinely believed his actions were reasonable, that the systematic imprisonment and abuse of disabled children was preferable to allowing them to live freely in a world that might not understand their needs. "Moreover," Silas continued, "you must surely understand that exposing this situation would serve no one's interests. These children cannot be helped by outside intervention, and their existence would only cause scandal and distress for the many families in this community who depend on the textile mills for their survival. Sometimes, Doctor, the greater good requires us to accept situations that may seem harsh to outsiders." It was the logic of a man who had convinced himself that his crimes were actually acts of mercy, that concealing genetic defects was preferable to acknowledging them, and that the economic well-being of the community justified any level of individual suffering. Dr. Penfield understood that he was not dealing with a man who could be reasoned with or reformed, but with someone whose moral compass had been so completely corrupted by power and family tradition that he was incapable of recognizing the humanity of his own children. The young doctor's response was interrupted by Mary Catherine's urgent whisper from the stairway. "Doctor, there are men coming up the stairs, Mr. Jeremiah and 2 others. I think they mean to trap you up here." Dr. Penfield realized that his investigation had been discovered not just by Silas, but by the extended family network that had protected these secrets for decades. His only chance of survival lay in immediate escape, but more importantly, in ensuring that the evidence he had gathered would reach authorities even if he himself did not survive the night. In a desperate gambit that required split-second timing and extraordinary courage, Dr. Penfield handed his medical bag containing the photographs and documented evidence to Mary Catherine, with whispered instructions to hide it in the servants' quarters and retrieve it only if he failed to return within 24 hours. "If something happens to me," he told her, "take that bag to the state capitol and find someone in the Attorney General's office. Tell them everything you've seen and make sure they understand that children are dying while politicians decide whether to investigate." The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive. Silas, realizing that Dr. Penfield had documented evidence that could destroy not just him, but the entire extended family network, made one final attempt to secure the young doctor's cooperation through direct threat. "Dr. Penfield," he said, "you are alone in this house. surrounded by people who have kept these secrets successfully for 20 years. Your word against ours would be meaningless in any court, and your continued presence in this community depends entirely on our goodwill. I suggest you consider very carefully how you want this evening to end." Dr. Penfield's response was to push past Silas toward the stairway, gambling that even the Weatherby family would not risk murdering a prominent citizen in their own home with dozens of witnesses present downstairs. His gamble paid off, but just barely. Jeremiah Weatherby and his companions moved to block the stairs, but the sound of voices from the reception below reminded them that Dr. Penfield's sudden disappearance would raise questions they were not prepared to answer. The young doctor made his escape from the mansion, but he understood that his investigation had signed his death warrant. The Weatherby family could not allow him to live with the knowledge he had gained, and they possessed both the resources and the ruthlessness necessary to eliminate threats to their continued dominance of Millbrook Falls. Dr. Penfield spent the remainder of that night writing a detailed account of his discoveries, preparing copies of the most damaging evidence, and making arrangements for the information to reach state authorities, even if he was killed, before he could deliver it personally. He also wrote letters to medical colleagues in Boston and Portland, describing the genetic consequences of systematic inbreeding and providing enough detail to ensure that other physicians would understand the significance of what he had discovered. The end came 3 days later, on December 18, 1856, in what was officially recorded as a tragic accident. Dr. Penfield was found dead in the Millbrook River, apparently having slipped on the icy rocks while making a house call during a winter storm. His body showed evidence of drowning, and the official investigation concluded that he had lost his footing in the darkness and been swept away by the current. But Mary Catherine O'Brien knew better. She had seen the men who followed Dr. Penfield when he left his office that final evening, and she had heard the sounds of a struggle near the river bridge. More importantly, she had hidden his medical bag exactly as he had instructed, and she understood that his death made her the only living witness to crimes that demanded justice. 2 weeks after Dr. Penfield's funeral, Mary Catherine made the dangerous journey to Augusta, carrying with her the photographic evidence and documented testimony that would finally expose the truth about the Weatherby family. The state attorney general, initially skeptical of accusations made by a young Irish servant against one of Maine's most prominent industrial families, became convinced when he examined the photographs and medical records. The raid on the Weatherby mansion took place on February 14, 1857. Conducted by state officials accompanied by physicians from the Maine State Hospital and representatives of the newly formed Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. What they found exceeded even Dr. Penfield's documented descriptions in its horror and scope. The third floor contained not 6, but 8 rooms, 2 of which had been hastily emptied in the weeks following Dr. Penfield's death. The remaining children, ranging in age from infancy to adolescence, were in various stages of malnutrition, illness, and psychological breakdown. The medical examination conducted by the state physicians confirmed that all of the children showed evidence of severe genetic disorders consistent with multi-generational inbreeding, and several showed signs of deliberate neglect or abuse. More damning was the discovery of Dr. Caleb Weatherby's complete records, which documented not just the breeding program, but also the systematic elimination of children whose conditions became too difficult to manage. The journal contained entries describing the deaths of at least 12 children over a 20-year period. Deaths that had been attributed to natural causes, but which the medical evidence suggested were the result of deliberate neglect or active euthanasia. Silas Weatherby was arrested along with his uncle Caleb, his cousin Jeremiah, and 3 of the servants who had participated in the imprisonment and care of the disabled children. Charity Weatherby, who had married Silas just 2 months earlier, was found to be pregnant and was initially considered a potential witness rather than a co-conspirator. However, testimony from Mary Catherine and other servants revealed that she had been fully aware of the third-floor situation and had agreed to the marriage specifically because she supported the family's genetic experimentation goals. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Maine's history, attracting newspaper attention from as far away as New York and Boston. The evidence presented by the state included Dr. Penfield's photographs, Mary Catherine's testimony, and the medical records that documented decades of systematic abuse. Defense attorneys argued that the family had been providing the best possible care for children whose disabilities made normal life impossible, but the photographic evidence of the conditions in which the children had been kept made such arguments transparently false. Silas Weatherby was convicted of conspiracy to commit child abuse, kidnapping, and accessory to murder in the deaths of the children whose elimination had been documented in Dr. Caleb's journal. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Maine State Prison, where he died in 1863, reportedly still maintaining that his actions had been justified by the need to protect both his family and the community from the scandal of acknowledging genetic defects. Dr. Caleb Weatherby, whose medical records provided the most damning evidence against the family, was convicted of multiple counts of murder in addition to the abuse and conspiracy charges. At 74, he was the oldest person ever sentenced to death in Maine, though he died in prison of natural causes before the execution could be carried out. The textile mills were sold to pay for the children's medical care and the legal costs associated with the prosecution. Millbrook Falls, deprived of its primary industry and forever associated with one of the most horrific family crimes in American history, gradually declined from a thriving industrial town to a nearly abandoned village. Many of the mill workers relocated to other textile centers, while those who remained found employment in logging or subsistence farming. The Weatherby mansion was abandoned and eventually demolished, though local residents reported that it remained uninhabitable even before its destruction due to the sounds of children crying that continued to emanate from the third floor long after the last of the victims had been removed to proper medical care. Mary Catherine O'Brien, whose courage had been essential to exposing the truth, was relocated to Boston with financial assistance from the state of Maine and support from Dr. Penfield's medical colleagues, who recognized her crucial role in bringing justice to the victims. She eventually married and raised a family of her own, but she never spoke publicly about her experiences in the Weatherby mansion beyond the testimony she provided during the trial. The surviving Weatherby children were placed in state institutions where they received proper medical care, though the severity of their conditions meant that most did not survive to adulthood. The youngest, who had suffered the least severe genetic damage, was eventually adopted by a family in Portland and reportedly lived a relatively normal life, though the genetic consequences of his heritage were passed on to his own children in ways that would only be fully understood by later generations of medical researchers. The case became a landmark in the development of child protection laws and contributed to growing awareness of the genetic risks associated with consanguineous marriage. Medical schools throughout New England used Dr. Penfield's documented evidence and Mary Catherine's testimony as teaching materials for courses on heredity and family medicine, ensuring that future physicians would be better equipped to recognize and address similar situations. This mystery shows us how power, when combined with moral corruption and community silence, can enable atrocities that persist for generations until someone with courage chooses to expose the truth regardless of personal cost. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Weatherby family's crimes? Or might there be other secrets that died with Silas in that prison cell? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.